Greetings, sword friends. Welcome to the second half of my European swordmaker tier list. Last week, I published the first half of this tier list video. Per senior sword friend Maciej Jensen's invitation, several sword reviewers, such as Kyle Smith and Maciej Jensen, simultaneously published their own tier lists. Check out their list first, and let's move on to the second half of this video. But first, let's address some of the responses to my video. To my surprise, the reception has been largely positive, and it has generated a lot of constructive discussion within the community. Some people pointed out I have been exceedingly generous with my letter grades towards these makers, even though I have some harsh criticisms against a few. Well, when it comes down to somebody's livelihood, I tend to be slightly lenient, and I'm going to explain my rating a little bit here. Some people are more than willing to place makers such as Darksword Armory and Angel Sword into tier F. But I have to consider that there are some experience shared by credible sword reviewers and practitioners over the years to have something largely positive to say about these makers. And we have to take that into consideration, rather than just giving some of these business an F wholesale. Now, there are also makers with credential and repute that reach out to me, said while they stand behind their research and products, they will gladly separate themselves from actual industry legends such as Peter Johnson and Gail Fabb and place them on a different level. And I agree that theoretically we can knock everyone on this list down a notch and only elevate a few into the true tier S. But then you will have to consider that even within the work of one maker, some pieces just have way higher complexity than the others. More research and labor has been poured into it. If we want to be super specific, I suppose we can even have tier SS or tier triple S, and even within the body of work of one maker, you can have different tiers. So my standards are, as long as a maker is very sincere in this research of historicity and the practicality of swords, and they interact with their customers with humility, then more than 99% of the customer base have largely positive experience with the maker, then we can comfortably place this maker in tier S. Lots of these are based on my own experience with their work. Some of that is based on the reputation, but it has to come from very credible source with all the pictorial and video evidence and all the measurements, concrete data backing up the claims, not just mere hearsay. Of course, remember, we're not rating any specific piece of a maker. We're rating the maker, right, as an artist and as a person. So keep that in mind. Without further ado, shall we continue? I think it's a good time to address some of the tier placements. You might notice that there are many makers in tier S and there are less in C and D. Just know that many of these bespoke makers have very few output each year. And as customers, you have to expect multiple years of waiting period. And that's just before they even start working on your project, right? Start the communication, your ideas for the source, appearance, period, purposes. So obviously, all of them combined together will not output as many swords as some of the makers in these lower tiers. I believe all the makers so far I place in tier S produce less swords than cold steel alone. So you get the idea. It's not really as it appears to be a reverse pyramid. It's actually just by the number of pieces they output. The ones in lower tiers absolutely outnumber the ones in the higher tiers. Next up, we have Kvetun Armory, a maker from Russia, and relocated to Georgia since the Russo-Ukrainian War. It started primarily as a supplier of HEMA sparring blunt swords, but since they work extensively with experts like Matt Easton for the designs of their sparring sabers, they expanded their business lately by consulting Matt Easton on some of the sharp swords. They also work with some HEMA practitioners from Finland
to design some competition cutting sharp swords. Their latest rapier models have the correct base thickness, starting above 8 millimeters, and this is a selling point, as many of the practice rapiers are overly thin and too flexible, which isn't a problem for Spartan models, as they are supposed to be flexible. But as historical sword replicas, they need to carry the correct base thickness and distal taper to handle correctly, but also flex in the correct way. So Kvetun Armory is definitely a maker that has a lot of potential. Since they are doing all the right things, working with experts, I think it's fair to put them in tier A. Next up, we have Landsknecht Emporium. And this is a maker from Hungary that's specialized in messer making. So primarily from the late 15th century to early 16th century. They have a number of different German long messer models. They also have a few Kriegsmesser, larger swords, but they are all single-edged swords. And this one here, the Gustav, that I reviewed a couple of years ago, has the iconic exposed full-width 10 construction with a langet at the end. But you see these wooden slabs were iconic for Germanic messers. They also make excellent scabbards, wood core scabbards, you can see here. Obviously, they carry a very distinct handmade appeal, very different from some makers like Albion or Valiant Armoury or Angstrom swords, which look rather modern, machined, rather perfect, just have less flaws like tool marks or asymmetry. Now, if you look at Landsknecht Emporium swords, they're not crude by any means, right? All the lines are still rather crisp and well defined and not wavering that much. But they do look more utilitarian, and if you look at the fit and finish, it's good, but you see there's more asymmetry than the likes of Albion. And they handle rather well. Okay, they offer a variety of different messers, different hilt designs. Some are hidden 10, some are exposed 10, different profiles, edge geometry. Some are extremely lightweight, like the Falke.
1.14 kilograms or 2.5 pounds. In fact, it is extremely fast, even with one hand. And with this long handle, of course, you have the option to use it with both hands as well.
It's still relatively light. It feels nimble and quick.
Some are more hefty.
So this sword is 5 pounds. That's a heavy sword.
If I compare these two side by side, this one feels kinda heavy.
In general, if you like messers, this is the place for you. Okay, they're a messer specialist, and their business owner, is a maker that takes commission of custom messers and bottomwares. Other than the messers, they primarily make swords in Landsknecht mercenaries arsenals, such as Kaspaugers, Dusaks, but also late medieval and Renaissance double-edged long swords. For that, I think Landsknecht Emporium is ranked solidly in either A+ or S. I would just place it in tier S for now, and that's almost exclusively for messers. Next up on the list, we have light swords, Jindřich Figura. I have to admit that I have no experience at all. I haven't heard much about this person. I think I vaguely remember hearing about his work, but yeah, no experience, no clue. And then we have a Living History Market, which is a maker that's based in East Europe, I believe. They offer a number of Migration era and Viking era sword reproductions. They have excellent, very accurate hilt designs. That's close replica of Viking era sword finds. But interestingly enough, they also have a number of Byzantine swords, and that's extremely rare on the reproduction market. Byzantine Empire has a number of interesting sword designs not found anywhere else. They have swords with lenticular cross-section without any fuller, and their hilt components are very unique. So Judging from the pictures, I would say that they offer very interesting swords. One problem is that their swords are made blunt, and if you ask them to sharpen them, you pay extra fees for sword blade lightening service. So essentially, they will do some additional grind work on their blades to make it more palatable to practitioners' taste. You know, probably grind a little bit more distal taper. I would like to experience their swords, but if I have to guess, they're probably in the tier A category. They're not very common either. You don't see a lot of experience of their customers being shared. Next up, we have LK Chen swords. Now, this is a Chinese historical sword recreationist, right? Primarily. But like I said, they have dabbled into ethno swords, like Persian swords, Mongolian swords, Japanese swords. They have a few offerings, but also like American, US military swords. Essentially, their model is history in hand, because all of their models are faithfully recreations of antique originals, either found at the museums like the Metropolitan Museum or in private collections. Now, their owner, LK Chen, is a practitioner himself. Like I mentioned earlier, he's not only a fencer, but also an archer, also a horseman. So he often practices jousting and horse archery. So he understands not just swordsmanship, but also historical combat in general. He also has experience in many different areas, not just Chinese martial arts. He also consults experts in Europe and the US. He worked with Matt Easton on the recreation of the Rebaudo Milanese arming sword, which is a Type 19, rather rare on the reproduction market. And he did a fantastic job with it. Long-bladed, lightweight arming sword. I did a lot of test cutting in my review. It cuts beautifully, very faithfully captures the handling characteristics of the original Alexandria Arsenal Type 19 arming sword. Very long-bladed, forwardly balanced, but not forward heavy. The foible of the blade is tapered to be extremely thin, but the base, the ricasso, is also well executed to be rather rigid. So that's a very atypical sword, and they did a fantastic job. Here's Matt Easton seeing the sword he helped develop materialize in his hands and executing some difficult back edge cut combos. It must be super gratifying. And that model alone could earn them a tier S. But then he started offering military sabers, such as the iconic 1796 British light cavalry saber based on antique acquisition. But like also I mentioned earlier, the US model 1860 cavalry saber, very well balanced, very nimble saber. Here we see Scalagram examining the two sabers he received from LK Chen and found a megaton of distal taper on the blade, which is completely faithful to the originals, resulting in very nimble handling, very precise tip controls. As far as I know, this is not done on any production sword other than one. You have to go custom and spend thousands. That one exception is the 1796 light cavalry saber by Windlass from an antique that Matt Easton sold them and insisted that Windlass should model the sword based on the measurement of the original. But Windlass currently only has one model made like this. LK Chen has close to a dozen, sabers, rapiers, side swords, arming swords, longsword, Kriegsmesser. The latest endeavors are his three models of rapiers. One Saxony rapier, which is kind of like a long side sword, a cotton thrust rapier that I reviewed late last year, garnered a lot of attention because even though it's a rapier and you think it's a thrust-centric sword, it actually cut even better than some of the longsword and two-handed swords because of the extremely refined edge geometry, hollow ground, diamond cross-section, really long blade, easy to accelerate. It can cut a ballistic gelatin thigh analog in half easily, and that's not a feat you will commonly find on one-handed swords. So not just an excellent replica of the original sword at Metropolitan Museum, but also just a good rapier, Renaissance sword. Definitely a tier S for that. Well, I would say that they could further bolster their ranking by offering a little bit even more variety in terms of European swords, but you know, they already have a very good diversity of swords. You know, Persian swords, Japanese swords, Mongolian swords, European swords, Chinese swords. Who can boast such a variety? There's almost nobody on the production market. Maybe some custom makers can do that, but even so, can they guarantee that every reproduction is as accurate? So this is what I give an exception to LK Chen sword, and basically the price range is solidly in the mid-range, okay? Not costing thousands of dollars, generally priced around $500, and that's basically a steal. You're not getting anything better for this price, basically under $800. And even above that, right? If you spend $1,000 or $2,000, you basically get something maybe just as good. Now, they're not perfect because many of the models are brand new. Some of the surface polish on their hilt components can be improved, right? But that's something so minor. And I have seen their improvement already. On their cup hilt rapier, they already have a more mirror or satin polish on the surface. So I would think that once they smooth out all these minor issues, definitely there's no question that they will be in tier S. But even so, given the price they charge, I think it'll be a tier S for me. Okay. Next up, we have Lonely Wolf Forge with Beem, which is a maker based in the US. And Wes is not exactly like other makers here because he doesn't make swords from start to finish. He usually take blades from other swords as project blades, either Albion Bear blades or blades made by other makers like Tom Kinder. And he also acquire hilt fittings from other makers, right? Either strip off other swords or something either he designed or somebody else designed but fabricated by someone else. He'll take these and he'll assemble the hilt. And also he doesn't do grip wrapping. So that's another thing. He'll send it to someone else if you want such a project. He'll do the grinding and sharpening on the blade. And he does a fantastic work at that. There is no question about his understanding of how sword blades should work. And it usually is very labor intensive too. So I would say if you can have a project for him and you can find other makers to support him, that's possibly a good thing. Like this demi-glaive, rather than Sentinel commissioned, Wes created the whole blade with a tan, very long tan, to be exposed in the hilt. And he didn't have the capacity to heat treat such a large piece, so he sent it to Brian Kurse to do the heat treatment, and then he sent it off to Steven Huerta for all the hilt work, the wooden slab on the side, but also leather wrapping and scabbard as well. So he doesn't do any of that. He does some knives from start to finish, but he has a number of things he wouldn't do, like guards, pommels. He just wouldn't fabricate them on his own. He can do some hilt work with some very exotic material, but you can't just basically commission anything from him. He's only staying in his own comfort zone, so to speak. So for the quality, I would say, probably tier A, and which is okay. Historically there are makers who only did blades, right, and they send them off for someone else to do mounting, the hilt work. That's no problem, right? But most of the other makers, they have someone dedicated to work for them on the hilt, or they do the hilt work themselves. So I think it's fair that to say Wes Beem is not on the same level or caliber as they are. Next up, we have Longship Armoury, which is a collaboration project between John Longdemo and a number of other makers. And they're mostly working in historically inspired fantasy swords, and they do fantastic work, right? Performance are incredible, handling's great, and everything basically on the same level as Longdemo himself, right? But probably with a better variety, I would say, maybe on the same level as Longdemo. I would say, yeah. Next up, we have Lukas Mästle-Goer. All right, he's a HEMA fencer, and he likes using sharp swords to cut as well. Yeah, you can find all that on his own YouTube channel. He is a physician by trade, and during his spare time, aside from doing HEMA fencing, that is, he will also take a commission making swords. From what I've seen, his swords are extremely well finished, right? He used primarily stock removal. And being a doctor, he really has the attention to detail, right? And the steadiness in hand to have, the top level of fit and finish. I would say tier S for sure. Next up, we have Lyndle Driggers. So this is one maker that does some short swords, mostly messers, sacks, short falchions, right? And he does some obscure types of these, short blades, and seem to have kind of a rough, handmade feel to it. But then sometimes he outputs pieces with excellent polish. I think he's more than willing to take on projects of very obscure types, and he hand forged everything from the blade all the way to individual fittings. And dorsal armory, are you looking? This is actual forging, okay? Shaping the blade inch by inch with hammer, not a staged show. I mean, you can see he even forged a guard with some complex geometries and transitions from a chunk of steel. If we look at this Elmsley Type 1 falchion as a case study, it's a very typical 13th century Anglo-Franco falchion developed by sword-cutting expert Philip Martin in conjunction with Lyndle Driggers, with a console from James Elmsley himself. And you can see this blueprint by Elmsley. Driggers did a wonderful job here, executing the unique distal taper profile and the proportions of the grip and the blade. Just a very good interpretation of the iconic cleaver falchion. And the stats look amazing. The performance by Philip Martin himself is very convincing. So at his best, Lyndle Drigger definitely can output tier S work, while some of his pieces are simpler and have rougher fit and finish. I think he rightfully deserves to be in tier A. Next up, we have The Art of Sword Making by Maciej Kopciuch, a very prolific Polish maker. Well respected in the field, yet we have uncovered some questionable practices, shall we say. First, let me offer some compliments. And this you have to give to Mr. Kopciuch, is that all of his swords look excellent. They have good proportions, and their aesthetics appeal to modern audience taste. The fittings, the blade geometries, and cross sections often carry very unique and interesting traits. He understands what modern audience wants out of the aesthetics. These pieces would not look out of place in museums or good historical film production sets. But when you peek under the hood, that's when you discover a can of worms. Alright, so I'm gonna share my own experience with him. And with all the receipt, I own a Type 14 arming sword named the Golden Cross by Mr. Kopciuch. And it's a lovely piece. I gave a brief impression during a live stream video with Master Jensen, and I have high praises for that sword. Nice fit and finish, clean lines, very smooth polish, very symmetric blades, very little flaw in the appearance department. But I find it somewhat unconventional in the profile. It is more triangular than the typical Type 14 swords, which is not a problem if you compare it to the Albion Sovereign here, and you will see clearly that Maciej Kopciuch piece has more pronounced profile taper, more triangular in the silhouette than the Albion Sovereign, which is no problem in itself. Type 14 swords are very diverse, and in turn it has less distal taper, especially in the bottom half of the blade. And the blade is rather hefty, but it moves mostly alright. And we're going to talk more about this piece later on, and some of the questionable practices that Mr. Kopciuch consistently employs to, shall we say, embellish his pieces to make them look better than they actually are. And we're going to establish a pattern based on some other pieces and measurements I got directly from other collectors. My general impression of his work is that he will make swords only with fullers, right? He will avoid making swords with diamond cross section of the late medieval types, type 15A, type 18, and those have very beefy base thickness and a very pronounced distal taper. And this is clearly what he tries to avoid because of the difficulty when it comes down to grinding the amount of labor that he isn't really willing to invest. If you really look at the actual measurement of all the pieces by the owners or the reviewers, and you're going to see a pattern. He tends to make blades very thin at the base. Right? My own Golden Cross Type 14 is 3.7 millimeters thick. Type 12 arming sword reviewed by Alien Tooth is 4.5 millimeters. The reverse edge falchion reviewed by Master Jensen is again 3.7 millimeters. I have a friend that owns a Type 10 arming sword, again 3.8 at base. The Marienburg longsword customer measured 4 millimeters instead of the 5 millimeters listed on his website. The owner of his Norman sword measured the base thickness at 3.5 millimeters rather than the 5 he listed on his own website.
This example of a Type 2 is that the spine is very thin.
And you might ask, what does that matter? It's only 1 to 2 millimeters difference. But remember this, swords are flat and thin objects. So 3.5 millimeters instead of 5 means that the base of the blade is missing 30% of the mass. And all that steel not present at the base is padded on elsewhere, usually on the upper portion of the blade, and significantly change the handling dynamics.
The sword this way and throw it around. It feels rough. It's hard to start the tip moving. It's hard to stop the tip moving.
These are quite the same, but not outside the spectrum of historical swords of these high Middle Ages, from the 11th to 13th century swords. But they are rather atypical. We do find examples of this on originals, such as the Mohnbrand sword owned by Jörg Oakeshott. And we do find this configuration on some modern swords, such as the Sovereign and the Type 10 arming sword in the back on the wall, a Albion Reef. This thin profile is suitable for 11th to 13th century swords that are focusing on cut rather than thrust taper. Whether you look at the originals and the well-made modern ones, it typically tapers more than 60% in the thickness because they don't taper as much in the profile. So that very pronounced distal taper is there to ensure the mass distribution, to enable the user to use the sword as a natural extension of their arm. However, when you make a sword blade too thin to begin with, you have to be extremely careful because you might run out of thickness to grind the distal taper on it. Now, some of the makers from both medieval times and modern ones like Albion can still produce thin blades with large degree of distal taper. However, Maciej Kopciuch does not do that. We can see here, in each one of these examples, the thickness of the blade barely tapers in the bottom half or 2/3 of the blade. This results in some very inaccurate handling dynamics comparing to the originals. And it also tends to make the sword overweight as a whole. So in order to keep the blade from getting out of balance, he'll have to place a large pommel by the end to bring the point balance back. And this practice is usually called the windlass tactics. That's used by makers of very inexpensive swords that does not provide the correct mass distribution on the blade, but instead rely on huge hilt components to balance the sword blade. This way, the blade doesn't really handle in the correct way and tends to be overweight. This is the first among the 3 major technical issues of Maciej Kopciuch swords. And don't worry, we're going to examine all 3, but also his tactics to address these issues or criticism. Off the bat, I can tell you, the way he chooses to address these criticisms is not to better his crafts, but rather using social tactics such as manipulation and gaslighting. For this very first issue, using very thin stock without too much distal taper, he tends to employ massaging the data in order to give customers the false impression that his swords does carry the correct distal taper, mass, and balance. And in many cases, his published specification of each piece is grossly embellished to make the sword look better. Take my Golden Cross, for example. The listed weight on his website is 1,250 grams, while in reality it weighs close to 1,400 grams. Here we see his tendency to inflate the base thickness of the blade from reality in order to make his swords look as if they have the correct distal taper. The most egregious example is the reverse edge falchion that he claims to be staying true and very close to the original in Musée de la May, when in reality it weighs 1,550 grams, when the original at the museum weighs 870 grams. With a wooden grip missing and a few nicks and chips on the blade, maybe adding 100 grams at most, so the original should weigh under 1 kilogram still. So Kopciuch has made it about 50 to 60% overweight. Not to mention the dimensions are all wrong too, and there's almost no distal taper. So we know why his reverse edge falchion handles like chunky crowbars, like some of the reviewers explained. Because when you have a blade profile that flares up in width, you really need a huge amount of distal taper in the thickness to offset that, to keep the sword still usable, such as this actually faithful recreation by falchion expert James Elmsley. It tapers from 5mm to 2mm at the broadest part of the blade, and then it narrows dramatically, therefore it has an increased thickness to reinforce this spiked area on top of the falchion. Whereas Kopciuch starts at 3.7mm according to Master Jensen's measurements and ends at 3.4. The handling difference is just night and day. Look, these are not one-off mistakes. These are clearly documented consistent behaviors. But you know what? It actually works because just like he predicted, most of the customers do not actually measure them. They'll believe whatever the hell you tell them on your webpage, which isn't necessarily the only problem with these pieces. These thin-bladed swords can perform very well in test cutting when they are properly sharpened and have the correct edge geometry, that is, which Mr. Kopciuch does not provide, right? Most of the time. I pointed out that the edges on that Golden Cross was not only insufficient for cutting, it's just a joke of an edge, which brings us to the second of the 3 major technical issues on his swords: edge sharpness, or the consistent lack thereof. I pretty much anticipated Mr. Kopciuch would dismiss outright the popular cutting media of modern practitioners. Test the sharpness with paper, he'll dismiss it as inappropriate. Cutting bottle in your backyard, he'll mock you as not being serious. Test cutting on tatami rolls, he'll say that's not the historically accurate target. While these claims are not technically wrong, it misses the whole picture that in order to test a sword's handling, how you can align the blade, how the sword can accelerate, you have to use it on some sort of modern targets. And whether it's model or mass, these are just available targets rather than accurate analog. But I'll do him a solid in this test cutting with his sword.
7 pounds of pork shoulder roast, very substantial. Gambeson made of multiple layers of toughened linen and cotton. This is a basic level of protection. Riveted mail, also known as chain mail in modern days. As you can see, the rivets in here. And this is not to even mention plate armor.
Let's see how his sword performs. As you can see here, the edge is basically the dullest one I have ever experienced on a sharp sword. It's worse than Windlass Swords, or Darksword Armory swords, or the Kingston Arms that I went over earlier and criticized their edge sharpness. The one on Mr. Kopciuch's sword is basically duller than a butter knife.
Completely failed to cut through. Let's do it again. Okay, once again.
When I used it to cut Gambeson, it couldn't even leave a scratch.
As you can see here, this long dent is where the cut landed. The padded armor is completely intact.
But then I removed the Gambeson to cut the naked flesh.
Without the padded armor, it's not even that. So there was a cut.
You can see here, it barely nicked the wrapping and did nothing to the skin and flesh underneath.
Used to be like this, and the Kriegsmesser bypassed about 80%, 90% of the width, which is about 10 inches wide, and caused a wound about 3 to 4 inches deep.
And here I swung twice at a piece of pork wrapped under 4 layers of thin cloth.
Did really nothing to the fabric. Let's do it again. There's some very superficial cut. It's just tearing of the skin. Doesn't really go into the flesh. I don't even think this will cause any bleeding. Just some bruises, obviously. Wow! Would you look at this? Huh? 5 ribs, and it just kept going into the 6th rib. Such a substantial amount of damage to this. Cut the linen and the wrapping and the tape, and then how deep? Wow! Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have a winner. And that's what grants its terrifying bone chopping power.
And if we look at the details of the edge does not have an apple-seed geometry. It has a very shoddy secondary bevel, very shallow, and has a sudden change of angle from the primary bevel, resulting in a very jarring shoulder. And the apex of the edge is simply not polished to any degree. It's completely dull. It's bordering on being just blunt. Now you might say this is an outlier, but we can see a very consistent pattern here from customer testimony and demonstrations. Corroborated by this customer here, and I quote, "For both of my Kopciuch swords, I'll say that there is no way, for instance, that I could ever cut myself when sharpening edges. I just squeeze the blade on my Type 16A hybrid between my thumb and index finger quite firmly and run down the length of the blade with no fear. This is on his Marienburg longsword. The forward third of the blade, where the profile taper is most pronounced, was unfortunately not dull, but blunt with a visible edge of probably 0.5 millimeters. This customer of his reached out directly to me and offered first some compliment, but then he said the sharpness of the box was not adequate. It was not sharp almost at all. Not really blunt, but maybe at a 10% of how sharp it should be. On this arming sword, the edge has the geometry of a sharp, but in an unsharpened or butter knife state. The owner of his Norman sword says the edge is thin, 1 millimeter or less, but not sharp enough to slice hand squeezing the blade and running along with it. It's very consistent with my experience and others.
Reverse blade falchion type thing, which was neat, but on the stouter side. And then the other was an arming sword that I had that I believe was dull.
Here's a massive cutting mask with the Kopciuch falchion with little success, indicating that the edges are very dull. But in his impression, he didn't even mention the edges on this one, but instead referred to the Kopciuch arming sword that he owns as being dull. So I can't even imagine what a complete blunt sword that one is.
But frankly, it's just not that sharp. You know, if I take it to a piece of paper, it doesn't really cut much. It can do a little tearing sometimes, but it's not very sharp. It really could be sharper.
It was not sharpened. It required some grinding and shaping of the secondary bevel before the final edge was applied.
All in all, it's not necessarily the end of the world if a maker ships swords with dull edges. If users intend the edges to be sharp, they can always sharpen the swords themselves. On the other hand, there's not much a customer can do if you ship a sword with thin stock and minimal distal taper on the blade. Still, you can absolutely see why it is problematic when these dull swords are marketed clearly as sharp, and when he even went out of his way to confirm to individual customers that the edges are indeed sharp. Because customers will need to invest their own money and time to do it after they have paid you thousands of euros for alleged sharp swords. Therefore, a mature way to address this issue will be to have a disclaimer, right? To be honest up front on the product page or in your direct messages to customers that you don't output sharp swords for legal or logistic reasons. Perfectly reasonable. Makers from Italy and India have to do that, and their prices reflect the reality of shipping swords blunt. What's not cool is gaslighting customers and in many cases insulting and taunting them, which are unfortunately the tactics Mr. Kopciuch chooses to employ in order to respond to this second criticism. Now, I'm going to tell you a story that my friend Alien Dude reviewed one of Mr. Kopciuch's Type 12 arming sword in 2022, and he pointed out the edge was completely dull. Right? It was shipped as a sharp sword, but completely dull. After that, Mr. Kopciuch published piece after piece of these long diatribes trying to rebuke the notion that medieval swords should be sharp, but he was smart enough to cloak it in languages that suggest that his swords are the good kind of sharp, whereas other sharpened sword made by other makers are actually toys. And he leans heavily in this angle. If you examine his, shall we say, essays, he often talks about how others make toys, and he refused to concede. He would rather make actual weapons. Quote, "Sometimes we admire toys, decorative imitations. We admire not the functionality, but the form of finishing, which in the past was subject to different criteria than today," which is true. But who are the toy makers you're talking about? And then here, we must learn to distinguish a conscious sword maker, an artist, from a dealer offering idealized sword-like toys. I'm pretty sure Maciej here placed himself in the category of conscious sword maker and an artist, who are the dealers that offer idealized sword-like toys? Answer me that. Are you talking about Albion? Let me ask you this. Do swords offered by Albion doing these at competition cuttings, year after year, months after months, seem like toys to you? And how do Mr. Kopciuch's own piece perform in test cutting?
Long dent is where the cut landed, completely intact.
Barely nicked the wrapping and did nothing to the skin and flesh underneath.
There are some very superficial cut. Doesn't really go into the flesh. I don't even think this will cause any bleeding, just some bruises, obviously.
Sharpness. My swords were adequately sharp, I thought. And, well, they did cut soaked tatami mats and ballistic gel just fine. But this one, Lee's Soldat by Albion, has been sharpened by Sean Franklin to literally shaving sharp. Look at the difference that a very sharp edge makes.
So that's strength with a good sword and fuck.
So it went this far.
Into the deep in the ribs.
Do kamery proszę! Do kamery!
Now, Mr. Kopciuch will have you believe that all of the modern media are not appropriate for historically relevant combat. Now, we do know that swords in the Middle Ages were made to fight your enemies on the battlefield who are clad in clothing, but later extensive use of gambison. And for armored knight, underneath all that armor, you have arming doublets, arming shoes, right? Very padded, layered linen, very highly protective. And people like Skullegrim and young Hotkevich have recorded swords failing to cut gambison to wound the fleshy targets underneath. But when you have a sword properly sharpened, it can cut through the gambison with ease and still do very significant damage on the flesh underneath. And actual experts, archaeologists, historian, and HEMA practitioners like Matt Easton, Peter Johnson, James Elmsley have extensively talked about how European swords were actually made sharp, and they're maintained constantly. Knights constantly ask their squire to sharpen the edges, especially after a battle where the swords clash with shields and armor. When Mr. Kopciuch talked about how swords should not be sharp enough because European metal armors are very protective, and which is true in combat. Swords were not used to cut armor, but when you're in combat, it's inevitable that you're going to hit them accidentally, and the sword should survive. But that's not an excuse that swords should not be sharp. We look at one of these long diatribes published by Mr. Kopciuch. He compared it to Japanese swords, and I quote, "The cross-section of the European swords is different, the angle is different, the cross-section is different, steel and hardening are different. These are true. This is simply due to the widespread use of protective armor in medieval Europe, chainmail and then plate armor. Therefore, finer, thinner edges with high sharpness were not preferable, which was in turn desirable in Japan, where the armor was made of leather," I assume he meant lacquer here, "fabric, or rice cardboard. Now tell me, Mr. Kopciuch, have you examined Japanese armor? Now, which one of these actual Japanese armor were made of rice cardboard, were made of leather? Yet the fabric components are the arming points. They are to attach the armor to the garment underneath. They are not made of fabric or rice cardboard. As if it was not plenty clear that Japanese armor was made of steel scales, laminar plates, and later full plates. I mean, this is the kind of research I would expect from Maciej. Right? He will tell you Japanese armor were made of rice cardboard, whatever that means. Right? It's just on par with the quality of assessment from those novices that look at European brigandines made in Italy and saw some fabric or leather backing in the front and assume that these are studded leather armor. If you can just take a few seconds to look inside, they're lined with big steel plates. So this is a level of research you can expect from Maciej. And we do know that based on his claim that his reverse edge falchion is as close as it can possibly be to the original at the Musée de l'Armée in Paris, when it's actually almost twice as heavy. And then he proceeds to perpetuate some more gross misconceptions, such as how Japanese sword blades has a flat cross-section, which couldn't be further from the truth. You know, the majority of historical Japanese swords have a very strong niku, a very strong convex grind to keep the edge and the blade durable. Now, if you look at many of the original European swords, they are much thinner than Japanese swords. They have a much smaller edge angle. Right? They're sharper in a sense, but they have an apple seat by the edge. Now, this is done by pretty much all the modern makers, such as Albion, right, and the other European makers. He went out of his way to spread these, I wouldn't even call them misconceptions, just outright otherworldly falsehoods, not even novices would perpetuate, such as Japanese swords are only sharp because they are meant to cut armor made of rice cardboard, that they all have flat round bevels, that European swords cannot be sharp because steel armor existed. These are either born out of deep ignorance, in which case I wouldn't even trust any research he does, or deliberately planted lies to gaslight customers to dissuade them from actually handling and using his swords, shift the goalposts on the fly to evade any criticism based on a set standards, which shows a lack of self-esteem and the confidence to actually stand behind his work. And this is actually very consistent with his behavior to deal with regular customers. If the edge is inadequate, totally blunt, he will actually blame you, the customer, for not being able to specify your need and gaslight you into thinking the level of sharpness is actually adequate for the activity you prescribe. Or in some occasions, when he simply cannot weasel his way using some mental gymnastics, he'll just point to others' experience that they receive sharp swords instead. Oh, I'm pretty sure that helps, right? Sure, you didn't receive a good product, but you know what? Other customers of mine did receive them. Yeah, I can't comprehend this line of thinking, how this could possibly help.
What's the most hilarious thing is that sometimes he bent out of the shape to justify his lack of quality in products so hard that he lost internal consistency. If you look at this pose of someone cutting some bottles with his swords, did just all right, and he immediately reached out enthusiastically saying, "Looks normal to me." Are you serious? Didn't you just pen an essay explaining cutting bottles with swords is misuse of the sword? Don't tell me you're trying to eat the cake while having it too.
Other than these very obvious gaslighting attempts, he often shows his contempt to people who offer honest review of his swords. Such as here, he shows some original swords from the early medieval period, and then he said that none of them would get a positive quote-unquote review these days. So these swords wouldn't get a positive quote-unquote reviews. And let me tell you something. If the original swordsmiths sold these to a bunch of housecarls, you know, the murderous elite warriors serving the jarls, you sell them these swords as sharp swords, whereas they're as blunt as butter knives, can't even scratch skin. I think the swordmaker wouldn't have a good time when these housecarls come back to confront you. Do you? he wears this utmost disdain for reviewers on his sleeve because he deeply resents any honest review that shows the actual measurements and expose the real weight and balance and distal taper on his swords, and actual tests done on his swords by impartial third parties that review the design flaw on the functionality of swords. Now it's a good time that we talk about the third of the technical issues of his swords, which is the lack of quality consistency. Some pieces have adequate distal taper, such as his Type 10 sword that my friend owns, which leads to relatively nimble handling characteristics. Others, like the multiple examples I have shown, have minimal distal taper, just like cheap reenactment grade stuff out of India. Some of his swords have decent edges and perform alright in actual tests, while the majority of sharps he sells are duller than any swords you have ever handled. Some of his swords, like the arming sword I have excellent fit and finish. When he curiously has zero concern over emulating antique originals' numerous flaws to be more faithful, a practice he purportedly advocates for in order to justify the fit and finish flaws on some of his pieces. Other times, his swords are sloppily finished with multiple flaws. You look at the sword a friend of mine receives. It has a broken tip, a crooked pin block with a large gap between the pin block and the pommel, surface rust and scratches on the blade, multiple deep pittings on the fittings, and torn leather wrapping on the grip. All of these on a 1300 euro sword. Honestly, it doesn't personally bother me if only one or two of these flaws are present. But all of them? The customer published a review revealing these flaws. Kopciuch offered some minor incentive and demanded him to delete the review. When the customer refused, he blocked him, insulted him on his own Facebook page, and then proceeded to pen a number of essays mocking his customer of playing with toys to fight shadows. Right? Simply because the customer thinks the price warrants a better level of fit and finish and some pride in the work. So basically, his solution to the third criticism is demanding allegiance from customers to remove any negativity from public views, even constructive criticisms, when the review is by and large positive. Failing that, he will mock you and block you. Some truly kindergartenish stuff. Now, to contrast this consistent behavior of his to the responses from some of the reputed makers, respected ones, such as Peter Johnson, who reached out to me on his own volition when I reviewed some of the flaws on an Albion Principe I received. The blade was considered by me somewhat underground, and he asked about the details from me, and then proceeded to contact Mike Sigman at Albion to arrange a return and have a new sword made from scratch for me. Angus Trim reached out to me on his own volition, saying that he watched my reviews and he saw my feedback of some sharp corners on the crossguard. It wasn't even a very big issue considered by me when I reviewed it, and promised to improve on future pieces. Matt Eason reached out to me to address some of the quality issues of the Royal Armoury Collection swords that he helped develop, and he freely concedes that Windlass has a long way to go in terms of quality control, and when his customer has issues, he encouraged them to reach out to Museum Replica to return the sword for a refund or replacement. So you see, these are the correct personality that will elevate these makers to true tier S, their respected status, because they have the humility to actually improve. Now, in contrast, Mr. Kopciuch is the only maker I have observed in the last few years that have the quality of the work actually degrade over time. Now, these coupled with his outbursts filled with gaslighting and insulting the customers, I think there's no accident. His vicious claim that Albion swords are stamped out of the machines controlled by computers is a lie that shows his callousness towards his peer in the industry, but also towards customers. As someone who has finished swords such as the Golden Cross, he knows better than anybody else in the industry that the majority of the labor-intensive work It's a grinding and polishing the fine file work of the blade and the fittings. And the workers at Albion and Valiant Armory do as much hand craftsmanship as anyone else in the field. It's just a very sloppily formulated crutch to excuse the shoddy work he put out. The reason is actually plenty easy. In this paragraph, he says that doing the work like grinding and sharpening is difficult. See, that's when he doesn't feel the need to invest in a piece, the kind of manual labor. So is it worth it? At the end of the day, his swords are still very historical, right? In the looks, it has unique traits on the choice of fittings and the geometries. But I just don't think the price ever warrants the kind of lottery experience that the quality, right, of each of these categories should depend on the mood when he finishes the sword. You can still do business with him. That's no problem to me. It's called freedom. But personally for me, when we assess a maker's ability, not just his work, but also the experience by customers, how many people are willing to put up with this kind of gaslighting and insult and months after months of diatribes aimed at you, claiming that you can't distinguish toys from actual weapons, to insult your intelligence? Personally, I would say that's a hard pass. If I want to commission something of obscure type, such as the reverse edge falchion, I would much rather get it from actual experts like James Elmsley or other reputed makers such as Manning Imperial or Ruffle of Inker's craft. Or if I want to get anything done by a Polish smith, I could get it from Damian Sulowski, Mateusz Sulowski, and Ruffle, or Jan Hotkevich. So if we judge from the one piece I own, despite the flaws, I will still give it an A, right? Because I'm an objective person. But even if I see more of his pieces, I doubt any one of them will truly reach tier S. And based on the customer experience, and his actual output of his swords, I will comfortably place him in tier B, and that's being plentifully generous. Next up, we have Malleus Martialis, which is a maker based in Italy. This is primarily HEMA training sword maker, but he also makes a number of sharp swords based on antique originals, right? Just like many other European makers. And those are rather pricey. There's swords made by him sold for several $1,000s, and they're of different complexities, mostly late medieval swords and some Renaissance swords. He has access to some antiques located in Italy. So I think, for the most part, yeah, this is an S for me. Next up, we have Marshall Suttles, and he's a maker, I believe, based in Washington, that does a number of fantasy-based swords. He makes some Witcher-inspired swords, but also some historical reproductions. I think his swords are rather affordable for something coming out of a maker in the US. It's good, but there's room for improvement, and I've heard that his blades sometimes have warps in it. Although it has to be said that he's more than willing to fix them if you ship the sword to him. So yeah, I think Marshall Suttles gets an A, and he probably will improve his craft, and in the future he can be placed in tier S. So far, from what I've heard, a tier A. Next up, we have Mateusz Sulowski. So Mateusz is a Polish maker, the brother of Damian Sulowski. He's been making swords for many years now. He has done direct replicas of many famous specimens from history, like the Schloss Ambras sword. Also, the Munich Type 18B longsword. He's made replicas based on that. He has made many pieces of reproductions on that. Very fine hilt work and attention to detail. One concern I have over his work is that it seems to be that the blade is not as thick as it should have been on many Type 18B pieces. Now, I have made similar observation on Maciej Kopciuch's work, but you have to excuse that because Maciej mostly makes swords with fullers from earlier medieval times, and it's okay for those cut-centric swords to be thinner. Now, a Type 18B sword is supposed to be rather thick. Type 18B, Type 15A, like the ones I have, the LB and ring neck on the wall, they tend to start thicker than 8 millimeters. And from the stats supplied by Mateusz himself, he usually starts at 6 millimeters. When you make a direct replica and you make such close recreation of the hilt, all the gilding, inlay, all the fine geometries recreated, but you have a blade that's quite different from the original. And this is a problem for many of the makers here. I can talk about arms and armor swords. They're much thinner than the original swords they even have access to. This is a problem. Good news is that Mateusz is always improving his crafts, and on some of the latest pieces of the Munich longsword, he started to use thicker stock at 8 millimeters. So to me, that suggests that he has realized this is a problem. And in this video, where a customer took 2 pieces of his reproduction of the Alexandria Arsenal sword to the Wallace collection for Dr. Tobias Capwell to examine, it's noted that the later Alexandria Arsenal reproduction he has made is a lot more accurate to the original.
Basically like the real thing from a lot of people now. Feels pretty much like a real sword. It's light in the right ways and it's heavy in the right ways. So I would say, I guess I would say, trying to hedge it a bit or fudge it a bit, if you were going to give me one of these, I'd go with the slightly bigger blade that actually is slightly less heavy up here.
Mm-hmm. This is Mateusz's only his own take on the sword before he had the dimensions. And this one here is the one that he based on the Alexander sword exactly. Woo-hoo! With the proper dimensions. So it's just a very, very interesting blind test.
This indicates that he is a maker that improves his crafts constantly. For that, I think he definitely deserves an A. And obviously, the quality of the hilt work on all of his reproductions. Next up, we have Michael Tinker Pierce. This is one old school sword maker based in the US. He is a writer, but also a firearm enthusiast. He clearly introduced many of us to historical swords by emphasizing on the handling dynamics. He comes up with a harmonic balance of his series, alongside many others, from the US and Europe, has to be said. So he put an emphasis on swords fine-tuned to be highly efficient in terms of weight distribution. So, like Landsknecht swords, his swords are generally lightweight and very nimble. They are rather simple in the hilt fitting, very well beloved by members of the community. So, for what he has done for the community, I think he has earned a place in the tier S. Next up, we have Nicholas Cohiolo. And this is one Fortune Fire champion. He has competed twice, I believe. First time he won, recreating Indian tabar.
Congratulations, you are the Fortune Fire champion for the Armorer class. You'll be moving forward into our Tournament of Champions for $50,000. How you feeling right now?
Second time he competed in Fortune Fires, he was asked to make a Dachi, and both him and his competitor did a fine work on that piece, and they performed basically neck and neck in all 3 challenges. In the end, the judges chose the competitor's work, but still, he did wonderful work, considering that such a large piece with intricate hilt components had to be done within a week. That's usually a piece for a swordsmith to create in weeks. He did it in 1 week. He's primarily an armorer, recreating lots of historical armor from different periods. but also he has picked up swordsmithing lately. And he's mostly interested in Renaissance swords, you know, the Schiavona, the Venetian basket-hilt Renaissance sword, and some Cinquedillas. Very fine work. I haven't had a chance to handle his work personally, but from his reputation and what I have seen, you know, stats and photos, it seems to me that it's a tier S contestant. Next up, we have Owen Bush, and this is a specialist in multi-bar blades. He obviously works on primarily migration era swords with multi-bar pattern welded blades, and well-known, well-respected in the industry. So I don't think there's any dispute if I rank him in tier S. He also does spare blades for other smiths to finish. Tier S. Yes, sir. Next up, we have Paul Beans. Okay, this is one situated in England, I believe. And he has many good pieces, right? Reproductions.
Here we see Maciej using one of his hybrid function as a hybrid between the Cunningham function and the Clooney function. You see, it can be moved with a lot of authority, but also nimbleness. His blades has the adequate amount of distal taper, which is crucially important to this type of profile that broadens greatly from the base. I've used this type of Cunningham function before. The broadest part of the blade is almost 3 times as wide as the base. So if you don't have the adequate distal taper, even if you have some degree of distal taper, it wouldn't move as well, which tells me that he has a good understanding of mass distribution on the blades. But still, if you look at some of the grip and the hilt components on his other swords, there are some weirdly fat grips in some of the geometries on both the hilt components, and the blade has some inaccuracy from historical examples. But mostly, his works are fine, particularly the pattern welded examples. So I think rank A is where he should be at.
Pavel Moc. This is a maker from Czech. He makes mostly bronze swords for HEMA fencing and form training. Very fine hilt work and good mastery of the mass distribution on the blade. It handles wonderfully. He also makes sharp swords, but seems that the way he makes sharp swords is that just modify the edge geometry of his blunt sword to be sharp. And for the most part, it works. And it cuts and handles well, right? But the problem is that the way HEMA training swords are created, it's a little bit different from sharp swords, right? They are usually a little bit thinner at the base. They have similar amount of distal taper, right, to handle, to give you an edge in competitions or sparring, right? Not moving in a very sluggish way, but if you wanted to have the correct rigidity of the blade, you should probably make it in the correct, thickness and distal taper as the original swords. And from what I've seen, many of these pieces look fine, like arming swords and Kriegsmessers. But I wish that you can commission from him to have blades that have the correct thickness to begin with. If so, that's clearly a tier S material. But so far from what I've seen, it's probably a high tier A plus. I will probably place him, about the same place as Brian Kurz. Next up, we have Peter Johnson, right? The designer behind Albion Swords. And he went to different museums to closely observe and measure all these very iconic medieval swords, like the Ljubljana, the national sword of Slovenia, and the other pieces from the Wallace collection. These are very good replicas for production companies, and he does obviously good design work, but he himself makes excellent reproductions that are prized among collectors. And lately, he does a lot of teaching to help younger swordsmiths He does a lot of lecture on medieval swords, migration era swords. He also has a new line of sword, Reflection series, basically pattern welded fantasy swords inspired by historical swords. They look otherworldly in appearance, and they are often sold for tens of thousands of dollars. And I know that Landon Morris donated a piece called the Athena to Metropolitan Museum, and that sword was sold to him for, I think, $30,000 to $40,000. So it tells you, other than the price, just the appearance itself, it tells you the caliber of this swordsmith. I think there's no doubt that he will be in tier S, but I think he will be one of the first, right, among all the makers. Highly respected. Next up, we have Purna Darnal, which is by trade a kukri smith. Now, he has done many pieces of historical European swords, but other swords of other origins, such as this Konda sword from Congo. And you can see that this is indeed a very typical piece. He built a custom quench tank for this because of the very unique shape profile of this blade. Well, you should know that in order to commission anything from him, whether it's European swords or other ethno swords, Asian swords, African swords, or fantasy swords, the customer is expected to design from start to finish. Right? He will ask for input. Anything that's not clear, he'll ask you about it. If you do not provide adequate input, he will just have some assumptions, and that doesn't translate well into the result. Okay, he is not a historical European sword recreationist by trade, but he can create them, right, with pretty good complexity, really well. And his works has been reviewed by yours truly for dozens of times, and because these were designed by competent customers like Brother Nathaniel, right, good understanding of historical swords, they turn out very well. But sometimes some customers just give some very vague, not even specification, just rough ideas, and it didn't turn out the way they wanted because they can't really even describe what they want. Then I think that should be expected. He specialized in kukri making. If you ask him to make you a kukri and you just have some rough ideas, I think there's no problem. He'll come up with some designs just fine. But if you want, let's say, European sword, but you don't want to do the work yourself, be warned, it doesn't necessarily come out well. Just this piece alone, he get on with it immediately after I pass on the design, with all the specifications of cross sections, fuller setup, all the measurements, the width, the profile, taper, distal taper, all the hilt dimensions. He got on with it immediately after, and there's no waiting time, even though he had to create dozens of kukuris every week. But he will allocate enough time for your custom commission, and he will update you almost daily. But you have to provide adequate input every time, right? After it has the initial drawing out of the shape, after the quenching, he will provide you with the current weight and the thickness, the tapering, and you have to give instruction whether to go further or there has to be some modification made. And if you're too shy or too lazy to provide the input, your piece will not come out well. Okay? So it's kind of like a stressful situation. But think of it this way. When you commission from other respected makers, you have to wait for multiple years. And when it's your turn, you still have to describe what you want. Right? For these tier S makers, it usually means that they will come up with some designs that will please you. But it doesn't necessarily will be the one you have in your mind, but unable to describe. Not to mention that the level of patience it requires to wait multiple years, right? Put down the deposit and wait for multiple years in order to even start a commission. Now, Purna Darnal will start your commission immediately, and then for about 2 or 3 weeks or even longer, you have to be in the pilot seat, basically. Do not expect this to be just like a cakewalk, right? You have to constantly give him the instruction, right? Whether you have to reduce more weight from certain sections of the blade, in what way? Do you want to change the cross section? Do you want to do a different distal taper, like a convex distal taper or a concave distal taper? You have to have good understanding of sword making and what the purpose of the piece is, right? Is it supposed to endure a lot of abuse? Is it just a fine slicer? You have to basically define everything, and even the hilt construction. You're able to do that, you're guaranteed with a piece that's satisfactory and usually amazing. But there's some inconsistency because he doesn't have a waiting period. So his working process is very stressful to himself. Sometimes there could be some aspect overlooked, right? Usually he'll provide a razor sharpness on all the edges. Look at this, it's a circular blade, but still, every part of the edge is highly polished. But sometimes he's just taking on way too many commissions, and the edge might not have the adequate final holding. It's sharp, it's just not as sharp as his usual. And there's one piece, among over a dozen pieces I have reviewed, there's one piece by him that's a recreation of Regenyei functions. He was given the specification. A Regenyei function has this very dramatic swelling in the profile, so you had to compensate that with a tons of distal taper. Now, the final result has a lot of distal taper. It's just not enough. It's supposed to be under 2 millimeters, but he stopped at 3. And compound that with not a very sharp edge, it just didn't perform, it didn't handle well, and it didn't perform very well. Still a very good piece, right?
Wow!
Yeah, totally through. It cut the meat completely in half.
Another problem is that he needs to provide a little bit better polish on the blade surface. For this piece, on this Konda sword, because all the originals also had rough finish, right, being African swords, that's okay. And I specifically required a rougher finish on the blade surface. But if you want a sword that is highly polished, you definitely have to push him to get there. And his usual polish is not gonna suffice, right? There's usually scratch lines or some file marks. You just have to ask him to polish all that out, okay? Especially when his pieces these days are no longer very affordable. They cost as much as an Albion sword, okay? And provide that you also invested a lot of your own effort, right? Research work and also communication, a lot of time to work with him. So you better make sure every single aspect of the sword is scrutinized before he shipped, okay? From the edge sharpness to the weight distribution. If you're 90% there, you lack the last 10%, it will not be a very good sword. But if you push it all the way, it will be amazing. Okay, so with all these caveats, he could very well create very complex project, right, with all these fine carving, engraving, but also inlay, copper inlay, with different materials, different exotic wood, horn, antler. These are all possible, okay? But you have to be in the pilot seat. You have to think like a smith yourself. You cannot just be a customer. For that, all this caveat, I think I can give him a solid A, okay? He's definitely capable, and he often output Tier S work. One reviewed by Matthew Jensen.
Or light and nimble, the nimblest of them, anyway. What I can say is cutting was an absolute blast. This moves through targets really, really well. With pool noodles, it pops them apart. Now, a pool noodle, it really just takes a really keen edge, and sometimes you can get by with a less than keen edge. If you have great edge alignment and good power, it can still pop a pool noodle apart, but it's certainly harder to do. With a really keen edge like this sword has, it really pops them apart. You don't have to swing hard, you don't have to swing much, and it just laser beams through the pool noodles. That's what this did. It cut extremely well. I found it to be very enjoyable to move around. You didn't have to do much. It was more like dancing with the sword, cutting a pool noodle. It was an enjoyable experience, which isn't something that I've had recently with pool noodles, so it was fun to experience. Cutting the water bottles as well, also very fun. Now, this has a very, very keen edge, and it cut through water bottles just fine, but there was one cut in particular where I took the sword with and just kind of quickly slapped it down the middle of a water bottle, into the neck, and through the neck of the water bottle into the rest of the water bottle. And it did it. It cut the cap in half, it cut right through the neck, it popped right back out. The water bottle was left there standing, and it really impressed me that it did that. A lot of times it'll push them down, it won't cut all the way through, it'll splatter everywhere. This one just cut right through it. I was able to cut and laser through to it was an excellent cutter. It was the best cutting sword that I've cut with in quite some time. And of the other swords, I was cutting with katana and a number of other swords on that day, and this one is the one that stood out as the easiest. And as I mentioned, I don't study historic European martial arts. I don't cut with type 18Cs every day. I've cut with a few of them naturally, but I don't cut with them frequently. And it was just so easy to use, a joy to use. It slashed right through them. It was giving me beautiful, clean cuts. Bad edge alignment, it really did a lot of the work for you, and the hollow grinding, however the edge is made on this, it just wanted to straighten itself out and move through targets, and it did it really, really well with just laser clean cuts on those tatami mats. It was surprising how well it cut, and it made me want to go more tatami and make some very expensive outing decision.
And that's really something if you know the number of swords Mateusz Jensen reviews. So I would say solidly tier A, and if you do the right thing as a customer, it could very well be in tier S. He also gets extra points for willing to step outside his comfort zone. He's highly adaptive, being able to take on any project basically. Next up, we're gonna examine Peter Regenyei Armory. So Peter Regenyei is a very respected voice in the historical training sword making industry. He makes lots of feather sword, but also blunt long swords. He also started making a number of sharp long swords recently, and more based off historical originals, like the recent Type 18A sword and the Irish long sword. I think Brother Nathaniel said it very well. Like Regenyei is like Deltine but better, and I have handled some of his feather swords, and they feel wonderful. It handles extremely well. Get his feather sword and you will not be displeased. And his sharp swords look very good. He offers more in variety. He can make sharp two-handed swords, right? Flambage, very rare, right, indeed. And different kinds of long swords, but also side swords, arming swords. I think he gets a very solid A, right? Next up, we have Reichhardt Swords. This is one based in Rome, Italy. I'm not sure whether he's Italian. His contact email is based in Chile, but he lives in Rome, and he comes highly recommended by some sword friends. Makes good reproductions of historical swords. He seemed to make a number of swords sold on Etsy as well, if I'm not mistaken. From what I've seen, solid A+. Yeah, especially for the prices he charged. Yeah, good stuff. Reichhardt Swords, tier A. Next up, we have a very popular entry-level maker, Ronin Katana. That's not a good name for a European sword maker. So you probably understand that they started by making lots of katanas, specifically for dojo use, right? Test cutting and iaido, like the art of unsheathing sword in Kenjutsu. Now they have a number of dojo pros, right? Just very affordable Japanese swords. They are so popular that they designed a few European swords by popular request, over a dozen models. Good variety, arming swords, different types, type 16, type 18, type 12. some long swords, 16A, 18B, 12A, but also shorter swords like sacks, also two Viking era swords.
With the edge that I sharpened myself. And yeah, you can tell it certainly makes a difference, but the factory edge worked fine for cutting. That was kind of neat.
That is fucking awesome!
They seem to be rather durable. The problem is they're not very well designed. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't dismiss their swords altogether. There's a lot to like about their swords, such as this your number 3-2 special edition of Alexandria Arsenal sword. They did a lot of things right, but overlooking certain aspect of European swords, or just with a lack of understanding how they should work, basically ruined the whole handling of the sword. First, the good part is that they have good profile, right? Looking from the side, they look good. They have well polished blades, right? The surface is rather flat and well polished. Not sure whether you can see here. And the edge geometry is good cross section, right? From one primary bevel from central ridge to the edge with solid apple seating. Sharpness is also pretty good, right? There's an attempt of the correct mass distribution on the blade. There's some distal taper, but this one I received in the year 2020 has less distal taper, right? Significantly less distal taper than their prototype of this sword. And that presents a problem because they designed a sword to handle certain weight, but as time progressed, their subsequent batches just do less and less work. Well, you wouldn't be able to tell by just looking at the profile because they still look identical as the prototypes. But if the thickness no longer tapers in the same way as the prototype, how can you expect them to handle and perform in the same way? There are other problems with their swords. Their swords are pinned, which is good, right? They usually have somewhat, historical designs in the hilt components, not overly large, not oversized, not overweight. But some of their swords have this very strange wheel pommel, and it actually feels partially hollow. The way it moves is very strange. First of all, it's already too small. Right? The original Alexandria Arsenal 18C swords have rather large pommel to counterbalance. Now, there are some misconceptions spread in the community that the pommel is there not to counterbalance, and this is objectively wrong. It's not just a hand stop, right? It serves that purpose. But if you add a lump of mass at the end of a lever, it shifts the point of balance. And the point, you should not rely on adding a large mass at the end of the sword to counterbalance the blade. If you do not have the correct distal taper or the profile, you're still gonna fail, right, in the sword's handling. It's gonna handle like a crowbar, but added with a lump of mass by the end, okay? So you should not rely on this to have the correct mass distribution. Do that in the blade. Still, you still need the correct mass in the pommel. For this formidable of a blade, you simply cannot have this small of a pommel. It's too small in diameter and too thin. Not to mention it's partially hollow and is competently pinned, I should add. You can see here. But it just does not have the counterbalance, and combined with lack of adequate distal taper, there's some distal taper, right? Just not enough. It's balanced extremely far away from the hilt. This one over here, you can see it's at almost 9 inches from the hilt. And we know that the original is between 4 and 5 inches from the hilt. So that just basically does not handle like the original at all, right? Even though the dimension, the width, right, the length are all identical, and even this engraving on the base of the blade. So that's just such a shame. And this company is not someone who look at consumer feedback and try to correct their mistake. And this is a big mistake. It prevents their sword from being good reproductions. For years and years, they just outputting these wrongfully designed sword. And this is one of their better designs. And just think about other designs. Like the Type 18B sword, like the Type 12A, they all have their issues. Either have the wrong profile, right? Not the correct profile taper, termination to the tip, resulting in a very short transition to the tip, or Type 12A have a central ridge, which should not be there on earlier type of Great Sword of War. You should all have lenticular cross section. And also in the hilt, some of the wasted grips have a very laughable central swell.
The grip. If you've watched my review of the Ronin Katana Euro number 10, you might remember that I'm not really a fan of their standard Euro grips, and this sword really drives home why that is.
By sweating in the middle in the thickness dramatically, it spreads your hand too far and you cannot grip the sword in the correct way. This one, since it's just a tapered grip, does not have that issue. Still, the geometry of this pommel is just not correct. Not only is all the balance, but when you hold the sword this way, the central hub of the wheel pommel is constantly grinding on your offhand. It's extremely uncomfortable, right? This is all the balance, so you have to do a lot to stop a cut. And when this thing, the central hub, popping out, is constantly rubbing against your offhand, it's extremely uncomfortable. So it's a shame that I can grind a little bit more diesel paper into the blade, but I'll have to, since this is pinned, I'll have to grind off the pin and remove the pommel to add a pommel made by someone who has the correct dimensions to not only counterbalance the blade, but also provide enough handstop, but also be ergonomic. So I would say you spend money to buy a sword that's ill-designed and half-finished. Okay, there's a lot of good things about Ronin Katana sword. If you look at a scabbard, it is well-shaped, wooden core scabbard with leather wrapping. The leather is not very good in quality, but it's adequate, right? And the general shaping is slender, it's good, it's not overweight. Okay, the fit is good. Also, the fit of the blade in the crossguard is excellent as well. There's not a lot of hot spot on this particular model, other than the pommel. And there's a lot of good things about this, but due to their lack of willingness to correct their design mistakes, it just prevents Ronin Katana's European swords to be good ones. And that basically just put them in tier C along with cold steel and even Hongshu, Darso Armory. That's just such a shame. They could be much more, but their owner's lack of understanding of historical swords and their lack of willingness to adapt and to listen to the community makes them not worthwhile swords. I personally would not recommend their swords, especially they also have lots of just quality control issues. Some swords come warped or blunt. So yeah, I will basically rank them as the same as cold steel swords, even though they have done a lot of things right comparing to the majority of cold steel's European offerings. Next up, we have Scorpion Swords. This is another one of those makers. I just see a historical sword or knife or axe, rough silhouette. You just water jet out the rough silhouette and grind half-inch deep bevel. onto the side. No attempt at doing all the hilt construction right or doing the distal taper. Bright side is that they are very cheap comparing to some of the others in the tier D. And you can probably use their pieces to smash up some granite slabs. But why? Also, they started to make longer bladed pieces recently. By longer blade, I mean longer than 20 inches in blade length, and it was a disaster in the beginning. People were able to bend their swords.
So I'm going to show you what it looks like now. Now, one time I bent it on a Gatorade bottle. Cutting a Gatorade bottle, it did not cut, and it bent the sword. Now, I'm looking, and the bend is actually right there, but it's pretty straight. And so now I'm going to try something. Alright, now, that was not that much pressure. And now look at it. Okay, so I think that this might not be heat treated.
Now, admittedly, they fixed that issue since then. By fixing it, I mean using ultra thick stock and still not having any proper distal taper or edge bevel, resulting in some 24-inch blade to weigh 3.5 pounds. So if you know any practical sword design, you know that's about 2 to 3 times heavier than it should have been. So tier D and reserves a higher place than some of the others simply due to their honesty about pricing and their total lack of effort to even have a modicum of understanding over historical sword designs. Next up, we have Starfire Swords. This is a maker who's mostly selling at Renaissance festivals, and that already tells you their core audience. You look at their swords, there's not a lot of understanding of sword making. There's no resemblance to historical swords, no regard to typology or different periods, swords, shape, geometry, or even purpose. They just like their swords look like if you ask a kindergartner to draw a sword, and that's probably what their drawing would look like. Okay, it's just a very cartoonish representation of a sword and not resembling historical examples at all. However, it's not all bad. I think if you put the historical aspect, the functional aspect aside, their swords look all right. They do not look extremely ugly, right? They do not look very impractical, and their swords are not priced very high. They're very cheap for stuff made in the US, although you can hardly call them swords. One exception being their flamberge, totally overweight and out of shape, sold for $2,000. I mean, if you compare it to Peter Regenyei's flamberge, which is like over 6 feet tall and weighs only like 7 pounds or something, and handles 1,000,000 times like a real sword, looks 1,000,000 times closer to actual historical flamberge two-handed swords in each way. That only costs under 800 euros. So I simply cannot comprehend. Looking at Starfire Swords pictures, there's not a lot I can say to not sound like a dick. And I don't want to be offensive towards this elderly gentleman who seems like a nice guy. I will offer some compliments that at least I can see an attempt on their swords to shape, the proper cross-section with a central ridge, a diamond cross-section, which is a lot better than badger swords or scorpion swords. So I would rank them, I think currently called Starfire Creations, rank them probably in D, okay? If I have to be honest, they look probably the look is on par with Angel Sword, but Angel Swords, in quotation mark, it's priced 10 times as much as Starfire Swords, and that just tells you something. I should probably put Angel Sword in the back of tier D, and Starfire Swords, for their honesty, right? They're not trying to pretend to be good swords. They're just Renaissance festival goers. You want something to be at your side, and to not be pretentious. And I think you can give them a D above Angel Sword. But if you put them side by side with Dipika swords. And even Dipika swords look much better and much more real than Starfire swords. Next one is Lockwood Swords by Stephen Lockwood. And this is not a very prolific maker based in the US. I'm not sure he's taking any more commissions. I heard that Alientude commissioned a sword from him a few years back, and that took quite a while because he fell ill during COVID. Took a lot of time to recover, which is okay. I'm not sure whether he takes commissions still. I like his sword. I have two. One is the Irish ring pommel longsword. That sword, type 19 longsword, is extremely rare. The only other one being reproduced, I think, is the Albion Gallowglass, which has been discontinued for some time. And this one really fills the void. I'm not even so sure Lockwood still makes them, but the one I have, right, it has all the right boxes checked. Hexagonal cross section, the ricasso at the base with two hollow ground, I wouldn't say fullers, just facets flanking the central fuller, and a very good distal taper to be very thin on the upper portion, very sharp edges, and despite being hexagonal in cross section, it's probably the sharpest sword, and sword cuts the best among all of my collections, right? And I probably should say it cuts even better than the Albion Principe, just in single cuts. I'm not talking about agility, the ability to redirect, okay? That really is a testament of the maker's skill, because Irish swords is supposed to be lightweight, but forwardly balanced, not forward heavy again. And that sword shares a lot in common with the LK Chen Rebuttal, which is a type 19 arming sword, right? Same type, different, right? One is an arming sword, one-handed sword, the other one is a two-handed sword. And they both cut extremely well, and is great, okay, in the leather hilt grip wrapping and the scabbard. It's just perfect. The other one is a type 15A bastard sword, very similar to the Albion Mercenary. But if you look at the blade, it's very purpose-built. Right? It's supposed to resemble the, the hand of half sword represented by the Albion Mercenary Castellan, but it has its own characters. The pommel is a squash type, fishtail type pommel that somewhat resembles a faceted sandstopper pommel, right? If you view it from the side, but it's actually quite different. It's quite small. I like that sword quite a bit, right? It has, like the other Irish longsword, basically has done all the right things about mass distribution, edge geometry, performance, handling. It's just all top tier, extremely well crafted and well thought out sword. So Lockwood definitely gets in the tier S. Here we have Sterling Armory, which is a very active new player in the HEMA scene, making primarily sharp swords, right, of different types. They are consist of 3 persons, very cool people. The most prolific guy among them is Chris Fields, who is a NASA engineer. And he is a sword collector and cutting enthusiast. He started making swords a few years back and been improving his crafts and been to many museums around the world to examine antique originals, study them. And he's also willing to share his findings with the community. So very cool. He's very active at all the HEMA tournaments, events. You can find his booths there, along with 2 other makers. And Angus Trim has given one of the Sterling Armory's maker very high praise. Okay, and Maciej Jensen has reviewed Chris Fields' 2 swords, one type 18B, one type 17. He is completely capable of executing swords of different geometries, and they feel wonderful. Kyle, aka the Alien Dude, also a big fan of their swords, so I would very much like to handle one of their swords. Okay?
You can see this sword has a lot of distal taper. It starts very thick right here at the cross guard and tapers very evenly right to about 2/3 of the way up the blade, where it gets much thinner very aggressively, and then it tapers again down, and then actually does reinforce a little bit at the tip. This leads to a blade that is got a little bit of flex out towards the tip, as you would expect, but it's mostly pretty stiff, which means it should make for a very effective cutter. But it's a very nimble blade, just enough authority in the cut. I really like it. One of the things Chris Fields does is make sure swords handle like swords. It sounds kind of goofy putting it that way, but it's a good way of explaining it. His swords handle properly.
From what I have seen, heard online, what I have watched, he definitely tier S. Right? And Chris Fields also took his own sword to Combat Con twice to win, gold medals, and so it really tells you the caliber of his work. And also the user, right? Chris Fields himself. Definitely in tier S. It also has to be said that all three of them have been improving their crafts in the past few years. So I think, without a doubt, right, in a few years, you're looking at even better, right, even more diverse offerings with more complex geometries on their hilt. Their previous, offerings can look a little plain, but, for the most part, they look very practical. The more recent models look more dynamic, with more styles of hilt components. So, yeah. Next, we have Swordier, and this is a new seller on the scene. I think he's based in China. He has been interviewed by Matthew Jensen, and if you're curious, you should check out that live stream video. I'm not so familiar with his work. He sells a number of Chinese, Japanese swords, also European swords. They look a little bit generic, but seem to be that they are made by makers responsible for Ronin Katana's Euro-line swords. And they have been sold elsewhere on Sword and Armory, but also Age of Chivalry. I have to experience their swords to be sure. Some of their offerings indeed look very interesting. Next up, we have Sabersmith, another Renaissance Festival goer's choice. None of their pieces justify the price they ask, and again, very little understanding of actual sword making or sword purpose and usage. Better than Badger Blades and perhaps Angel Sword, they do demonstrate some minimal willingness to incorporate some practical elements into their pieces, such as a hexagonal cross-section or octagonal cross-section on their grip. There's some steel wire wrapping, not done very well, yet still there's some interesting bevel grind, such as hollow grinding on the edge bevel, even though the blades don't inherently come with any proper cross-section. That is, but in general, their pieces look better than Badger Blades, Starfire, so you get and not as outrageously priced as Angel Sword. So you get a higher place in tier D than Angel Sword. But still, their pieces look far worse than even Dipika and Universal Swords. Those cost only a quarter of the price. If you look at some of the latest pieces by even Dipika, from a distance, they look far more practical, far more historical and realistic than the ones turned out by Sabersmiths and Badger Blades. Next up, we have Tod Cutler. That's just a first look at Tod's personal crafts. Tod's Workshop has his popular YouTube channel. He makes swords, but other forged items, or the leatherwork items for popular TV shows like The Witcher. He has a very diverse interest, shall we say. He makes a number of things, from arrowheads, bows, crossbows, all the way to trebuchet, and slings, assassin's crossbows, but also he makes lots of daggers.
This is just one of those sort of crazy German things where they just did it because they wanted to do it and could do it, but it's also quite posh, let's face it. Gold-plated fretwork with some nice bright red leather behind it, bit of fretwork steel on here, wooden scabbard, and an all-steel hilt. This is 100% bling, 100% awesome, 100% functionality.
Also swords, like arming swords, long swords, long messers, barnwares, incredible work, I should say. And they're quite pricey. This is basically the price for the commission from someone based in the UK. I have seen his Zweihander sold for over 800 British pounds. Oh, very hefty in price. And everything I've seen so far indicates that he has good understanding of not just how swords should work, but also everything else, from the hilt work to scabbards. I own 2 of his scabbards. One is the one for the Albion region in the back. The other one is a scabbard for my Albion Principe. Very good work, but they all have a very handmade feel to it. Right? He's not trying to make them perfect, look as if they were touched by human hands, which is the case. Okay. Now, his reproduction swords are not one-to-one replicas. Okay, even though they're very close to museum originals, housed at Wallace Collection, at Royal Armories, like the Risen Hilt 3-branch Germanic sword. Right? He lengthened the hilt to make it more like a long sword rather than a hand-and-a-half sword. But he captures all the essential components one-to-one, like the hilt in the Bastard sword. So I think there, without doubt, Tod gets an S, and rightfully so, with his own work. And I think I'll even push him rather high. Yeah. And let's talk about Tod Cutler. Because his own work is so pricey, he wants to have a more affordable line for people. Right? He started making a number of daggers, right, by having contract makers, affordable contract makers, making components for him, and seem to be assembled in UK.
Tod Cutler does sell antenna daggers, rondels, messers, ruggers or burnware, main gauche, quillen daggers, basilars, I think you're getting the picture by now, dirks, stilettos, and a whole load more things. And just in case you think I'm talking bollocks, well, we sell them too, by the fistful.
And they are very beloved daggers crafted by Tod Cutler, especially the rondel daggers. And bullet daggers, phenomenal work. Definitely captures all the geometries and the hollow ground in the blade, but also central ridge on the spine, the way it's pinned, how the hilt is shaped, right? Different components, perfect. Now, recently he has started offering swords in his more budget-oriented Tod Cutler line. And by budget-oriented, I mean his swords are priced between $500 to $700, and they are relatively short-bladed swords, arming swords type 14, falchions, messers, and also a Wakefield hanger. Not a big variety, but obviously this is just the first batch. Right? Started in 2023. He's gonna expand his catalog for sure. These swords are considered not very beginner friendly. Okay, they're rather pricey. Their fit and finish look pretty good, very comparable to the Royal Armory's collection line offered by Windlass. They also offer a sharpening service, which is good because they're all made blunt. I don't have any personal experience with them, but I have seen reviews. They haven't generated a lot of buzz so far. I think it's that the type he chose for the first batch is a little bit more generic, type 14 arming swords. They are already out there. It's very similar to the Albion Sovereign. They also offer a good scabbard, so you have to take that into consideration, right? Even though they are relatively pricey. Their scabbards have Tod Cutler's own shape, which looks fantastic. Back from the gym, shall we continue? Here's another example of Tod Cutler's work. The asymmetric bullet dagger by Tod Cutler. You can see it features asymmetric designs. One side has a more stout edge geometry, the other way is more suitable for fighting. This is more stout for work. Basically, very lovely entry-level budget piece dagger and very historical. If Tod Cutler's daggers and maces quality is of any indication, their swords are also of tier A quality. Of course, they can use a bit of variation, diversity, but then we can expect that in future batches. Tod Cutler goes solidly to tier A. Next up, we have Universal Swords. This is another reenactment grade sword maker. They make buckloads of military sabers of European origins from the 19th century, 20th centuries. I do not have their European sword, but I have one Shamshir over here. And I have to say, you could do worse for the money. It's not very typical for a Persian Shamshir to have this little curvature in the blade. I would prefer a much more curved blade. But the weight is about right, just under 2 pounds, about 1.8 pounds or so. Balance is in the right place. There's a little bit of distal taper, not as much as historical Shamshirs, and they come blunt. So, on glance, they look all right for a character in the background to hold one of these. If you have any, period drama or any filming projects, there's nothing about them that stands out and screams, "That's not a historical sword," right? It just look all right. And many of their European swords in the reenactment grade are also, have relatively accurate profiles, but also hilt designs. Sometimes they're a little chunkier than historical originals, but if you don't look at them up close, you wouldn't find out. Also, they tend to have some degree of distal taper on their European sabers. Not as much as you want on an accurate reproduction, obviously. They're also made of EN45, low-cost carbon steel. It has a carbon content about 0.5%, so pretty soft. Don't try to sharpen them up and do some cutting tests. They won't hold up, right? The edge will be dulled very soon. The heat treatment is not suitable for any impact, so you potentially have a broken blade, and if you sharpen them and they break off, it's still pretty dangerous and fly into random directions. But if you just swing them around as form training, they're all right. They're not very accurate. Don't try to understand the handling characteristics of original military sabers just by holding these. But if you carry them around, it's not very cumbersome and not overweight. Usually, just not very representative of the originals. So that gives them a solid tier D status. I would say still above Starfire and Angel Swords, because if you just look at a silhouette of the swords they're trying to replicate, you can still recognize, the model, the pattern they are emulating. They capture a lot of the traits, the appearance, so much better than Starfire Swords or Angel Sword. Next in line, we have Valiant Armoury, which is based in Texas, US. And this is one fan favorite, as they were pretty popular among collectors. Back then, they used blades sourced from Chinese makers, according to their specification, of course. And they do the hilt work in the US. They're pretty budget friendly, just between $300 and $500. So they offer a pretty good variety of swords. But there's some quality control issues, and also their contract makers have limitations on the blades they can fabricate. So they switched to in-house production by investing in CNC machines, mills, and work with renowned makers such as Angus Trim on their designs. They have their pretty unique hilt take. Usually their hilt components are rather historical. There's some fantasy element from time to time. The hilt they put onto the blade are often anachronistic. So you're not expecting the most historically representative swords, even though, I mean, handling-wise, they're pretty close to them. It just, you know, the hilt styles are not really that representative to the typology. Of course, there were similar practices back in medieval and Renaissance times. Cutlers use earlier made blades of earlier styles and remount them onto contemporary hilts. So you will find some swords in museums or private collections having rather odd combination of blade and hilt, but also sometimes people use blades from one region but mounted onto hilts style in another region. This kind of practice was usually referred to as being bastard swords. So back then, that's what being a bastard sword means, and not the like a crossover between one-handed and two-handed swords. And lately, they work even more closely with Angus Trim on the Vision line. Angus Trim personally picked a number of models, and because he has more than a dozen different models, variations for each typology. For example, just for Type 12A alone, Angus Trim has, I think, more than 20 different variations, and they handle very differently. And they have different appearances as well. And Angus Trim picks some fan favorites for Valiant Armoury to do their own take on the hilt design. However, he's more strict on the hilt mass. So in the end, it doesn't matter what style of pommels or crossguard they pick, they have to result in the same handling characteristics as the ones made by Angus Trim. And this prototyping goes back and forth, and eventually they'll reach an agreement to coin one model and give it a name, which I like, because one thing Angus Trim is not particularly good at is the marketing front, and he just named different models as the type and model number, and it's not very easy for fans to memorize. I mean, of course, for someone like me who is very familiar with all the variations, iterations of one type, I would probably memorize most of the models, like type 10A.5 and 10A.6, their sizes, the handling traits, right? But for someone who's new to these swords, not only it's hard to memorize, hard to understand, but also it's just not very catchy, right, from a marketing point of view. Now, the Vision line, along with other Valiant Armoury swords, are also given, each individual model is given a name, and it's called, Strasbourg, Talbot, Exeter, Lion, Milan. So it will help customers to memorize and associate the name. Usually it's a city's name to the specific type, but also the handling traits, which is a great practice. And Valiant Armoury is able to recreate Angus Trim's original designs, handling traits, according to Gus himself, which is fantastic. They also inherit many positive traits on their Craftsman series swords, such as one singular bevel. There's no secondary bevel, not like on Angus Trim swords. They are very clean in the lines and edges, very symmetrical, and they have very graceful termination to the tip. And this is rather rare on Angus Trim's own swords. If you look at some earlier Angus Trim swords, like Type 15 or Type 18B, they usually have very graceful transition to a tip, to a very acute tip. But in his later years, he tends to make swords with broader transition to the tip, shorter transition to the tip, resulting in a broader upper section. I guess that deepens the bevel. It's better for cutting because these swords are used extensively in test cutting. So that's one reason for him to do that. But I like Valiant Armoury's take on their Vision line. which looks very pleasing and closer to many historical originals. So, yeah, I think Valiant Armory rightfully deserve a place among their Tier S peers. Next up, we have Viktor Berbekucz, and that's a Hungarian maker, just like Peter Regenyei. He makes a number of fencing swords, long training swords, also feather swords of different sizes, long swords, two-handed swords. They're usually quite austere in the looks. And you can look at this Technique feather by Viktor Berbekucz, sold by Purple Heart Armory. Just have very simple hilt components. This sense stopper or pear-shaped pommel, and not a lot of geometries in the blade design. Just like a flat. It has a fuller in the center, and it shares a lot of traits with many Eastern European sword makers. Basically, having no distal taper in the lower half, and only tapers in thickness from the midpoint to the tip. So it feels quite metal heavy. So this is hard to explain. If you have a blade that's even in the tapering of the thickness, and you have a proper degree of distal taper, it will feel rather nimble, okay, but also flexed in the right place. If you look at this, it's properly rigid. Right? It's probably too rigid for a training sword, right, to spar with. You can jab into someone's throat and do a lot of damage, which is not good in HEMA fencing for sparring. But you can see that there's a degree of profile taper, so that offsets some weight distribution. But the lack of distal taper in the lower half just makes it a little clumsy, right, than an average longsword. You want a sparring longsword to move in a nimble way, which this Technique feather does not move in. It behaves more like a great sword of war. So it has a lot of authority in the cut, very rigid, very smashy in feelings. Basically, this can be applied to all of his swords, including one sharp sword he makes for Purple Heart Armory. It's basically a very wide blade to emulate those type 18C blades to capitalize on Albion Principe's success, but doesn't really capture the type 18C's graceful transition, right? The profile taper. It's more like a triangular blade, and it does cut quite well because that blade also has a half distal taper. So even though it has more profile taper than the Albion Principe, it doesn't taper in thickness that much. Overall, it just feels like a heavier Principe, and it doesn't move very slowly. Some people take this sword to cutting competitions, and they perform relatively well. And for that, I have to commend Viktor Berbekucz for providing, such a competent tool on a budget. These feathers are sold for around $200, and the cutting competition sword is sold for $350 or $400 now, and that's a lot cheaper than the Albion Principe or even the Ronin Katana's Alexandria Arsenal sword, and it handles a lot better than that one, even though the profile isn't as accurate as the Ronin Katana one to the original. So I think that places Viktor in tier B. I don't think his work is as good as Krieger historical, but definitely better than many of Cold Steel's Dark Sword Armory's swords. He worked with a number of historical European martial art practitioners, and many of them use his feather swords just fine. So yeah, I think like a lower tier B will be fair. Next up, Vince Ivans, and this is the sword maker even Angus Trim referred to as a sword god. And that basically tells you everything you need to know about him. A very knowledgeable historical sword recreationist, but also dabbles in all sorts of fantasy swords, ethno swords, and many of the antique dealers retains him to recreate certain components like hilt for bear blades, antique bear blades, and he does amazing work. Okay, impeccable, immaculate fit and finish, but he understands everything about swords, so I would place him very high, even in tier S. Next up, we have Vladimir Cervenka. Now, this is a Czech maker, and from what I have seen, he is pretty good at providing accurate reproductions on a budget. I'm sure many of his swords handles just fine, but I would place him probably in a higher tier 8. And similar to probably Reichhardt Swords, Pavel Moc, etc. Similar to Reichhardt Swords, Pavel Moc. Next up, we have Windlass Royal Armoury's line. But first, we have to talk about Windlass' own brand, because I think the Royal Armoury's line is a separate entity, kind of like a contract work for Royal Armoury's museum, and designed all by Matt Easton himself. It's like a higher level brand, essentially like Lexus for Toyota. So you can hardly judge them on the same merit as Windlass' own swords. So let's just look at Windlass swords, because they are not really on the same level as the Royal Armoury's line. Clearly, they are the biggest player on the market, aside from cold steel, and they have much bigger capacity than the likes of even Hanway. And they basically occupy the lowest tier of functional swords. Right? They are clearly better than Topeka universal swords, and demonstrates a degree of understanding in functional sword making, reliable heat treatment, hilt construction. The blades on their swords are usually rather faithful, okay, from time to time. Some models are much better than others, so you have to judge case by case. But in general, their swords are functional. You can do some test cutting with them, and they generally would not break in half, and that's a good thing. They also do not handle like crowbars, right? At least most of them do not feel like crowbars. However, they have been very content with occupying the bottom of the barrel in the reproduction market for decades. And the market has evolved quite dramatically since 70s and 80s. There are many players on today's market that have a far better understanding of sword making than Windlass. Unfortunately, Windlass has chosen to stay where they were. For the most part, they are more than happy to sell their lower end swords for the lowest price, and thus having the biggest customer base. And that's truly a shame. Okay, they have tried many different models to capture some historical original pieces without too many successes. And they have retired most of these models, just have like a skeleton crew of the basic models. But even these are usually just not very well designed. If you look at this one, it's a classic medieval sword. The original model of this is kind of a disaster. If you look at the profile, it's 10A, type 10A. It captures, for the most part, right, the look of it. It has some odd hilt components choice, curved crossguard, which is very atypical for the type. But for the most part, it looks all right. When you hold it, it feels like a heavy crowbar, right? 3.5 pounds for a very average length arming sword of that period. It's just not acceptable. Okay, whereas everybody else on the market can make type 10A of the same, type that weighs 2.5 pounds, right? Like the Chen swords, right? Much more historical, has a masterful command of distal taper, mass distribution, handles wonderfully, has one singular primary bevel that terminates into a very well-polished apex, cuts extremely well out of the box, good scabbard, very tight hilt construction, very attractive. This one here is just like a relic in the past, right? Handles like a crowbar, looks all right, and it's just basically in the same category as the Pika and Universal Swords, except they are better heat treated to be durable. So essentially what people call beaters, right? Backyard beaters, derogatively. So there's not a lot of place for their swords anymore, even for the low price they ask for. They sell for a lot cheaper in Europe than in the US, basically $100, $200 euros. But even for that amount of money, I'm not so sure it's worth it. Of course, there are exceptions. They have different models that handle better, right? Also, their models do not always handle like a crowbar. And some are a little bit more, refined. Some are lightweight, right? And when they are lightweight, they are usually lightweight crowbars. There's no distal taper in the blade at all. They are known for that because the thing they care about the most is the cost, right? To lower the production costs. So either you have heavyweight crowbar or you have lightweight crowbar or something in between, right? That can be at times accidentally decent. And there are some models like the Indian Talwar they make for co-seal contract, has great distal taper, right? Weighted and balanced very well. There's a number of swords that just happen to be decent, like the Man-at-Arm Long Messer, also for co-seal contract, turned out to be great. Right? People love how it handles, performs very well. Happens to be a short sword, so it doesn't need a lot of distal taper. But they're bread and butter medieval swords like this one. It just does not handle like historical originals at all. But you're thinking, I'm holding the sword. It doesn't look bad and it doesn't seem to handle badly. Why is that? Because this one has been modified by sword friend Leonard. And you wouldn't have guessed how much time he put into the modification of this sword. He basically ground this steel flat that does not have any change in the thickness at all into a blade with proper distal taper from the base to the tip. And he also refined the profile. Also, another thing Windlass is known for is that they never care about the proper cross-section of the blade. Right? One should have lenticular cross-section without the central ridge. They wouldn't care. They just have a diamond cross-section with a central ridge, and not a very well-defined one, admittedly, but it just look out of place, right? For all of their Viking era swords, this Stick Listad Viking era sword, it just kind of like a disaster. It has a central ridge after termination of the filler, which is totally historical, and there's no distal taper until the very last, 1/4 of the blade. The blade is overly thin because the lack of distal taper, and it's not as wide as it should have been for a Viking era sword. It has very weird choices, like the bolster on the ferrule, the grip. It's just overall very odd looking, and it handles like a crowbar. You see, this one doesn't have much profile taper at all. Without the distal taper, it's horrible feeling. Okay, for someone who haven't seen many actual Viking era sword, they will think this is probably okay, right? If you haven't handled an actual Viking era sword like the Albion Jarl over here, right? That one is very authoritative, but still a nimble sword, okay? Because it's designed to have the proper mass distribution, like an actual Viking era sword. Windlass swords are not made like that, at least until very recently, and this thing is about to change. But let's just finish the talk about their classic models. And basically, this is kind of a shame, right? They put a lot of sauce into the copper inlay in the hilt, etc. But not only does it not have the proper hilt construction for Viking era sword, like separate pieces for the pommel. But they also do not handle like pierced swords at all. And this can be said about basically 80 to 90% of the swords. Like the Christus Imperial rapier that I compared to a LK Chen rapier in the LK Chen rapier's review. It doesn't have much distal taper at all, and rapiers really need a good degree of distal taper, which is found on the LK Chen Saxony rapier, not so on the rapier made by Windlass. They usually start around 4 to 5 millimeters, while these narrow-bladed 17th century rapiers generally start around 8 to 11 millimeters, so they are half as thick as they should be. And there's not a lot of care on their hilt work as well. So essentially, they are battle-ready warhammers. Like warhammers, you can take up the wall and smash something without breaking it in half. Okay, so they're better than universal swords and the Pika. Back to this classic medieval sword by Windlass, swordfriend Leonard has spent more than 40 hours grinding this, giving it a proper cross-section, a lenticular cross-section, and the tip termination, and also refined its profile, but most importantly, reduced a lot of weight through the grinding of distal taper. So near the tip, it is now properly thin, and you see it starts to flex in the correct way about here, rather than flexing from the middle. During these 40 hours, he also took a lot of weight from this crossguard, which is like a very strange, tapered, curved crossguard, rarely found on pierced swords. Now it's straighter, so it looks much better, but also he grounds some tapering even into this pommel, wheel pommel. You see, many original swords have tapered wheel pommel, like tapering in thickness. And he also did that to reduce weight from this pommel. So overall, the sword lost about 20% of the weight from the places it needs slimming down the most. Now it's also properly sharpened. As you probably know, all Windlass swords come dull. Now you need aftermarket sharpening services. Their edge geometry is usually quite coarse for you to grind an actual edge onto. Now, after 40 hours of work, this sword is a proper medieval sword reproduction. But you have to ask, is it really worth 40 hours of your time as a customer? How much money can you make in 40 hours? I don't think that's worth it. Okay, I could spend that amount of money on a properly made sword. But, you know, if you are really into modifying swords, some of the Windlass models can be modified, right? You can fix their sword to hilt ratio. You can grind an actual distal taper on that, reduce loss and weight on the upper portion. You can refine the edge geometry. You can really just fix the profile, can make them shine and feel like even a high-end sword. Also, don't forget the very simplistic hilt work, the grip wrapping on their swords. You can also do a proper leather wrapping on the grip with risers and cord impression. So there's a lot of potential for their swords, but they generally choose not to refine on the things they already have. Until very recently, they have received very competent counsel from Matt Easton, and Matt Easton offered to, they sent some models for Matt Easton to review, and Matt, being a very encouraging person, offered to take measurements and take photos on some museum swords using his connections in the royal armories. So after many back and forth rounds of prototyping, they finally reached the final phase and put those models into production. I think Matt Easton did a great job helping Windlass Swords producing these higher end swords. They are much pricier than their stock models. So Windlass Swords usually sell for, I would say, around $200. And after this many years, they usually sell for $250 to $300. Some models are priced a little bit higher for the complexity, But in that category, right, the Royal Armory's collection swords are sold for $600 to $800. So basically 3 times as much. And I believe they are truly worth that price, because essentially it's like the museum line for Albion swords. Okay, and museum line or Albion swords are usually twice as expensive as their next generation lines, right? Even though their qualities are the same, right? They are made in the same way. They just replicate museum examples, right? Not just any examples, carefully chosen specimen, well-preserved ones, but also ones with very interesting backgrounds, very unique, traits on them. I think Matt Eason did a good job choosing several specimens for the first batch. Very iconic English swords, such as the Wakefield Hare, the single-edged arming sword, which is a type of falchion, and English two-handed swords, long swords. Just they handle very well, just like the originals. The stats have a little bit of variation from the originals. I'll look at it this way. If you ask the original maker to make you a replica of the first sword he made of that type, if they do not have the original sword in hand, this is probably, right, even though it's different in some minor ways, these are probably the swords they can come up with. So to me, that's totally fine, right? Even though you aim for one-to-one reproduction, replicas, you can almost never achieve that with handmade objects. So as long as you capture the spirit, right, the most important trait, like the hexagonal cross-section on the Type 17 sword, and they're weighted and balanced in very similar ways, I think that's a great job. Right? And for me, Windlass swords, most models should be in tier C or tier D, but given their recent endeavors, right, not just working with Matt Eason on the Royal Armory's line, but also they receive advice from Matt on their 1796 British light cavalry saber, turned out to be great in handling. There's something that's not quite right on the hilt components, but if they listen to consumer feedback, they are able to fix it on future batches. And also the Suintaka Viking era sword. And also, they sent the prototype to Matt Eason, and after some advice given, they modified many aspects to make that sword closer to original Viking era swords.
It does have distal taper. I haven't actually measured it, but I can clearly see it. I believe this starts about 6mm at the base of the blade and tapers down probably to about 3mm. You can see from the flex it has good distal taper. So I think some people are used to older windlass models from years ago, before I started working with them basically, that don't have any distal taper at all. This absolutely does have distal taper, and you can see it's completely stiff in the first half of the blade and flexes in the second half of the blade.
So that's great. Even though they have made many swords not so great in the past, I think as long as they realize the need to improve, from this point on, they will just go upward, right? And also, I have seen some recent models where their contract works, for United Cutlery, Hongshu brand, for Cold Steel, the Filipino sword. That's not a European sword, right? But still, it demonstrates a better understanding of swords, functional swords, better mass distribution, greater degree of distal tapering, and they just did a very solid job for the price. So I think for that, Windlass should earn a solid tier C, and because of their willingness to improve, I think we can give them the place above Ronin Katana. Royal Armory's line will go straight to tier A. Now we know that there's a second batch of models chosen by Matt Eason to reproduce, including a Great Sword of War, Type 18 blade arming sword, just like the Albion Kingmaker in the back. And there's great hope for these new models, and I think if Windlass can iron out some of the minor issues in the quality control department, eliminate some of the smaller hot spots on the hilt, but also the inconsistency in the blade, there's great hope for their brand. They can go into Tier S one day, hopefully. And the last one on the list is the winter cutlery. So I haven't personally handled their work. I have seen the product pages of their swords. Seems to demonstrate a good understanding of sword making, and they have good weight and balance, but also mass distribution, great distal taper. If what they list on the pages are true, and I do anticipate them to be true, and the picture shows a very promising, and the photos paint a very promising picture of their products. So I speculate that they can go into Tier S. Okay, the last one is Zombie Tools. Interesting. They output some post-apocalyptical flavored blades inspired by historical swords and knives and axes. Now, they are made in similar ways as those American Renaissance Festival goer choices swords, although they do demonstrate a limited amount of understanding on sword making, such as proper edge bevel and the balance of the blade. Their blades do not have any distal taper. Now, the entirety of the mass distribution on the blade is reliant on the change of width, the profile taper, and some attempt at introducing more mass into the hilt, such as adding very heavy material as grip slab. Like on this one has aluminum scale, which is about 3 or 4 times denser than wood, and having these 2 slabs of metal flanking the full width 10, introducing a whole lot of mass into the hilt. So their swords are usually balanced in a way to make them wieldable. However, they're just not ideal when you use them to go up against legitimate swords. There's no comparison, and they tend to be overweight. Now compare an average lance blade, such as this Albion knightly sword, not even very lightweight at all. You see the blade is much longer, but this one weighs twice as much. So you understand why there's no hope for you to win a duel up against someone holding one of these. Not to mention even like nimbler swords created by the likes of Angus Chen. What you sacrifice in maneuverability, you gain in durability. And being made in 5160 spring steel and well heat treated, they're indeed durable, and not more so than properly made historical swords. That has to be said. But they have very cost-effective constructions, and they do look the part if you enjoy the post-apocalyptical aesthetics. So there you go. Zombie Tools can reside in Tier C.
And thus, we have concluded the tier list of all the European sword makers. I'm pretty sure we have left out a few. Some of them are not particularly prolific over the years, but whatever they output, they have poured enough effort into the research and the construction of their pieces. We have to give them credit. Now, whether you agree or disagree with my rating, that's totally okay. If we miss out any important makers, or you have any of your own experience to share with any of the maker ranked in this list, please leave them in the comment section down below. And remember to keep the conversation civil. If you enjoyed this review, find any value or entertainment, please like and subscribe.